welcome to the episode. I'm Danielle Radoichin, and on this episode of the In Talks With podcast, I'm speaking with the artist Jaclyn Conley. Jaclyn is from Canada and based in Connecticut in the US. She creates works that are large, containing whole worlds, with figures pulled from apparently vastly different references, but when joined together on her canvas, somehow they find a whole new way of relating to each other. She likes to play with non-linear time and weave in ideas relating to protest and politics. Physically, her works are large, with thick, energetic strokes of oil paint. The colours are soft and feminine, and the mood is quiet and introspective. Standing in front of them, it's easy to imagine living with them. There's a lot to talk about with this fascinating artist, who, though only in her 40s, has already produced such accomplished pieces. We met at the start of an exhibition of new paintings at the Mercier Gallery in Brussels, and talked about the themes and references she uses, how it relates to what's happening in the world today, as well as her working life as an artist and how it all fits together. Hi, and welcome. Thank you so much for talking to me for the In Talks With podcast.
Thank you.
We're here at the Mercier Gallery in Brussels, and we're sitting inside the gallery surrounded by some of your work from the exhibition, which is called Castles in the Air. The exhibition runs until the 19th of October. So I thought, just to kick us off, maybe you'd like to explain a bit about how this all came about.
The whole series of paintings are quite layered. There's many ways to enter into the imagery. There's art history references that run throughout. A lot of Flemish painting, Bruegel painting becomes kind of a stage to these paintings. But they're stages that are peopled by figures that I've found in photographs, documented, often countercultural figures from the late 60s, early 70s. And these are people who were sort of striving for something to change. So whether they were anti-war activists or part of the Back to the Land movement that was taking place afterwards, they are individuals who are searching and in some ways kind of inspirational in that way. It's a story that we can look back to as maybe not entirely successful, knowing where we are now. But it's interesting to sort of recognize that where we are is because of these steps before us. And so it becomes these layered narratives in these paintings that sort of moves across place and time. But still, I think with this overall sense of searching for kind of a hope, something optimistic, some kind of way forward.
Yeah, I love that. It's really interesting. There's a lot to talk about. How many works have we got here? Is it 10?
Or 11, 10 or 11.
10 or 11. What's the dimensions?
They all are sort of 60 by 72. There's, some, I measure in feet. So
yeah, we do feet. I do feet as well.
Okay. 7 by 9 or 5 by 6s. They're all a larger scale, I think, because I was thinking about the landscape as the set for the figures. And so the paintings in some ways needed to have room in them to sort of place these figures.
That makes sense. So it's quite nice the way they're hung because they're so large and you've got one per wall space. And it feels like they do need that space to breathe, and because they're so impactful at that size. How did you feel seeing them all together like this?
Yeah, it's really interesting to see them all in the space, and to see them each on a wall with space around them, because they're very full paintings. There's so much going on in the narratives, in the compositions, and so having that space around them is really important. I was kind of thinking of them as world paintings, so there's sort of this impulse to fit everything into a lot of these paintings.
A whole world inside.
Somewhat. There's just so much expansive that I think I was thinking about in the paintings. And so most of them are a larger scale, and then there's one smaller collage painting, which is sort of distinct from the others.
So the ones that, apart from the collage then, these are oil on linen, I believe?
Yes. Yeah.
Tell me about why you chose that material.
Mm-hmm. I've always painted in oil. I love paint, and oil paint especially. I don't think I could paint in any other way. The paintings are figurative in a way. The representation, the imagery is always very important, because stories are important, but the material itself, there's a love there. The materiality, the way that the paint feels is just so unique.
Yeah, because actually seeing them in real life as opposed to on a computer screen, which is how I saw them before today, the texture of the paint is so thick. It's like a kind of Frank Auerbach level of thickness, and it's almost like it's really sensuous. It's almost like you want to kind of touch it, eat it almost. It's so thick. There's a real physicality.
Yeah,
to the work, to seeing them in person. For me, I really noticed that straight.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, I think that is what keeps them exciting as well.
That's an interesting tension as well, what you're saying. I mean, I wanted to ask you much more about the content of the story and the narrative in a minute, but that tension between the physicality of the work and then what's contained in that work, it's almost like it's a kind of interesting tension there.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that comes into the collage as well, because there are so many types of paintings within these large paintings, but a lot of the abstraction that comes through is partly due to the collage process that sort of creates opportunity. So often I'll do a small collage version of the compositions, or they might be standalone paintings, and they're collaged out of pieces of other paintings, old paintings that didn't succeed, failed paintings, which were painted oil on wood. And so having those physical brushstrokes that you can then handle and move around, I think it has changed the way that I actually paint with a brush on linen. Just having that relationship with the movement of marks. It's a different sort of sensibility that I wouldn't have had otherwise.
Yeah, I love the idea of reusing your old,
right.
your old stuff.
Yeah, there's so many, I have all these surfaces, and there's a lot of time and a lot of emotion in them, especially when they didn't turn out. And so it's kind of a nice feeling when they have a new life, and you can sort of find.
Yeah. Is that something that artists do a lot? I haven't really ever spoken to someone about.
I don't know. I think, I think artists have a tough relationship with paintings that didn't work, whether it's to just set them aside with the hope of returning, or to smash and burn them. There's different ways of sort of coping with failure, but the movement towards the next thing, ultimately.
So you're based in New Haven, in Connecticut, is that right? Is that where you created all these works?
Yes, yeah.
So you have a studio there?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
The name of this exhibition is Castles in the Air, which is the name of one of the paintings in the exhibition. So if we start talking about the stories or the content of the paintings, that one's maybe a nice place to begin with. Did you want to talk a bit about what's going on? Yeah,
so it's a Thoreau quote, and I kind of take it to summarize again that similar gesture of aiming for the impossible, for trying difficult things.
Is that a personal thing that you like to do? Is that something you yourself?
I think I try to more and more, seeing that as the only option.
Because it helps you grow, or in that way? Or
I think it is the only way forward, because I think, thinking about some of the problems that we're going to be facing, that we do face in society and our relationship to nature, I think we have to be a bit courageous and think a little bit differently and not do what's always been done. And so I think that's always in my mind, that now is kind of a time where we have to try new things, and if they fail, it's still worth doing. That we can't be complacent or overly cynical. And so that's somewhat in that Thoreau quote, this idea of having big aspirations, not giving up.
So that's Henry David Thoreau,
Yeah.
who was a 19th century writer. For people who don't know, he wrote a book called Walden or Walden, I don't know how you pronounce it, that became very famous, especially with the kind of countercultural movement of the 60s and 70s. Right. But you've used some quotes from his work as inspiration towards these pieces as well.
Yeah, and I think looking back through history, it's interesting how the same impulses recur. So something that seems so of the moment for us, how we're using the land, how we're going to think about our relationship to nature going forward, and even how we organize our time and how we think of freedom. He's thinking about those same things, the sort of the threat potentially of technologies, coming into our lives without us questioning them so long ago. But I mean, even thinking at some of the art historical paintings, they're not new thoughts. There's sort of a slight, remembrance that, I guess in this case specifically, slowing down. Yeah. So much of that is in Thoreau, as well as resistance, not just going along.
He was he was advocating going back to the land, and he did it himself, sort of living self-sufficiently off-grid.
Yeah, for a short time, that it was an experiment, and again, it's an unusual thing to do. It's not a rational thing to do, and yet it allows for a new perspective and a space for thought that he couldn't get if he was just rolling along with life. And so there's very specific stories, but they're all connected in some way. They all have a similar impulse running through that I think is, again, it's not a failed sense of progress. It's not like those are failures, but it's interesting to look back at them and to see them as potentials. And
explain a bit about how you've used how that links to the work, because maybe we should bring in now the Peter Simon photos, because they document people who actually who actually tried to live like that.
Right. So I work from photographs, finding figures from archives that sort of document interesting moments, important moments, mostly in American history, but not specifically. And so in this work, a lot of the photographs were from a commune in Vermont, where there were many other sort of on the East Coast in America during the late 60s, early 70s. And this is in some ways after a time of real unrest, a time of loud protest. And so some of these figures I was using previously in paintings of marches and protests and crowds. And so they were a coming together to solve a problem, to be heard, to create change. But after a certain point, things, again, failed in a way. People couldn't come together and realize the goal because they're human. And so from that, you can sort of see a back to the land movement where people were retreating and setting their own sense of what their world could be.
Yeah, I think you said somewhere as well yourself, retreat is a form of protest.
Yeah,
which is
a quiet protest.
Why not?
But, yeah,
if going out as a crowd didn't have an effect,
right?
It's a different way,
right?
Yeah,
yeah, and I think that's just really lovely, and I think important as well. That protests can be slow and quiet and still be powerful. And it takes maybe some patience to understand them and to see them, but that's there too.
Can I ask how you first stumbled upon these photos? And what was it about them that appealed to you, that jumped out?
Yeah, I think I was really considering America as a country. In many of the previous paintings that I'd been doing for a while, looking at presidential figures, looking at the ideals of the country. And so that kind of rolled into protests, that kind of rolled into people who were trying to define what America would be or could be. And so those figures came through in some of the archives, and just looking around, figures that moved through music movements, through politics, through different spiritual directions, but just this kind of generation. It's mostly this generation that was relevant to today.
You can see, I mean, I Googled them, and you can see a few of them online. I'm sure not as nice as if you see them in real life, but they're incredible, the photos. They're black and white. They're of, so it was the early 70s, sort of?
Yeah.
Vermont?
And
so there's a few different communes, but
yes,
it shows photos of people living together in a community, doing all kinds of things like swimming, working, having fun, playing, and they're really, really evocative.
They are. They're beautiful, and because so many of these individuals were writers and poets and artists and musicians, there's just so much documentation of them. There's these pieces left that we can look to and sort of imagine what that was. But there is a sense of breaking some boundaries and doing things a little bit differently in those, and looking for beauty. And it was just an interesting space to imagine, because you have hints of what's going on. There are characters in some of the books they wrote, or poems written about them, but there's this whole bigger story of their lives, and that you can sort of only imagine.
They ultimately failed, these communes. Is that what
I think?
Or do you see it differently?
I think some of them still exist, but it's sort of it's human that the plan will never continue without change.
But the point is trying, even if you're going to fail. It goes back to what you were saying.
I think so. Yeah. That there was some success in there, even if it wasn't a permanent solution to everything. That there was hints of possibilities.
Mm-hmm. So in Castles in the Air, or maybe some other works you'd like to bring in as examples, could you talk a little bit about how you used elements of those photos and brought them into your works here? Yeah,
so I'm bringing images together. The figures are usually not from the same source. And so many of the figures are almost living in their own spaces. They exist in the same frame, but they're not necessarily, interacting with one another. So there's an interesting separation between the figures that I find interesting. But within these landscapes, I think it was just interesting to think about them as, a population defining their own land, defining their world and their society, moving through the landscape. And so moving through life. There's so many suggestions of time, whether it's seasons or whether it's a passage from the left to the right of the canvas or from the front to the back. There's sort of these suggestions of movement, of travel, of growth, of experience, of being human. So even though they're not telling a specific story, it's the suggestion of searching, I think, more than anything else.
That's interesting, yeah. And is there this sense, because I suppose because you also have brought in elements from something completely different, which is paintings by, for example, Peter Bruegel from the 16th century. And it's almost like this idea of reassembling different elements to create something new, which is similar to collaging, I suppose, in a way.
Yeah.
And like you said, creating a different time narrative or travelling through time in some way. What makes you think, this would go well with this? Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, I think there's not a direct rationale behind them, which makes it interesting for me. But finding those connections is more interesting because there are connections. They're narrative paintings. They're figures trying to work together, to live in the world, to live in nature, and humor. There's so many smaller moments, interactions between the figures, as well as these just big expansive spaces. And so there was a lot that was pulling me in with those paintings. But more than anything else, it's interesting to just find those connections, to not set them out beforehand, but to see these figures as, traveling across time, that is sort of an interesting possibility, that there isn't maybe a direct singular story that's being told, but there's sort of documented lives living or many things happening at once. And then I love the paintings as well. I love art history, and I love the storytelling that's in there, the empathy that comes about through that storytelling. And it's an indulgence in a way to be able to go back to those pictures. Specifically Bruegel, one of the painters who I first loved as a young person, who I was able to connect to. And so it's sort of a real pleasure to just spend some time in that space with these moments.
Yeah, that's really nice. It's sort of bringing in this like inspiration, the aesthetic inspiration, but also it's really interesting, the idea of creating a sense of a world that isn't necessarily just linear.
Right.
It's really it really starts to come to life when you think about it like that. And you've also talked a bit about how you prefer not to paint from life, but you like to paint from still images. Do you think that first of all, it made me, when I was reading that about you, it made me think of painters like Lucian Freud, who, famously sort of put their sisters through an agonizing process of sitting in one position for hours and hours, freezing cold, fully nude, or, and I like the way you said that you wouldn't like to paint a person in real life because you'd be too worried about if they were hungry or thirsty.
Yeah.
But do you think that it creates a different quality in the image? Is there a sort of remove that comes from it not being from a live painting?
Yeah, I think of removes as being kind of important, and that's maybe a component of history as well, that it provides a remove. Even Bruegel, looking back to sort of mythology and history, but something other than his own time to contend with the things going on in his world. And so photography, it does provide that distance, and it happened. It's a document, and there's something interesting about that it's sort of has an aspect of a truth in it. But there's also so much room to imagine in it, because it's only, as I was saying, it's only a hint of the whole picture. And so it's inviting us to just fill in the rest, with our own subjective. And I think also the photographs can become a little bit more playful in a way. In a lot of these spaces, I was thinking about the figures as characters almost, as moving around the space. And it's such a different relationship than to think about setting up a person and imagining them in the composition. It's a little bit more playful to sort of think of them more like an object that's moving around in the story that's unfolding. I think it's a lot about my own personality or temperament as well, that painting from life becomes absolutely about that moment. It becomes about the interaction that's happening, and the revelations from that are specifically about that moment, the temperature in the room, like I was saying, or the light, what happened in the morning, how the emotions of the two people are that day. And so it would definitely be different.
And that's because I suppose that's interesting, because what you were saying about these works, and some of your work in general, is this idea of bringing in different moments of time. Whereas, like you said, painting from life, it is just that one specific moment. That's really interesting. And I also was thinking about the figures in your work, you talking about your temperament and this remove. I've noticed how the figures are they tend to be turned away from the viewer. You might create some detail in facial features, but they're never really looking at the viewer. They're turning away or looking down. There's a hair covering the face, I can see there. That also creates a kind of remove, they're quite introspective works.
Yeah.
Is that a reflection of you again as a person?
I think it may
Not
be.
to overread.
No, and I think it wasn't something that I set out or intended, but it's definitely there, that the figures are often looking into the distance or looking down. They're not looking at us. They're not, in some ways, they're letting us look in a little bit more easily by not looking back.
It really does feel like you as the viewer are looking into their world. They're definitely not looking out.
They're not acknowledging us. Yes. Yeah. I think in some ways it allows us to sort of take a part in that picture a little bit more easily, to imagine what it is they're looking at beyond ourselves.
Mm-hmm. They're very reflective works. Sort of introspective, reflective. I could spend a lot of time. Tell me a bit about your upbringing. You're from Ontario.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I've always drawn, painted later on, but it just seemed like an activity that filled time. It was just something that was always available.
Did you grow up in the city or more rural?
Sort of outside of cities, and really not a lot of structure. I felt like I spend a lot of time on my own, and mostly for my own choice.
You grew up with siblings?
Yes. So I have a brother. And he's also a drawer. He's also an artist. So we were both just always doing this. So if we had to go to an appointment or be somewhere, you just always have something to draw. There weren't phones, or we could bring books. But I think we were both a little bit quiet and introverted, and excited about sort of making things too. That was really interesting, that you could make new spaces, make stories, characters. That was just sort of somehow a given. It's just sort of what we did.
What did your parents do?
So my mom was very creative. She worked as a secretary, administrative in a few jobs. We were raised with a single parent, so she was working a lot. She was working a lot. So a lot of the times we were we were at home. And I think there were moments where we did get to go to art museums and see art. It wasn't thrust upon us or deemed very important education, but we grew up near Detroit, Michigan, which has a beautiful museum. And that was one of my favorite places to go. Very almost church-like. There's something very, something to be honored in that space, very beautiful. And so I had some exposure to art or looking up to something that's beautiful and something to aspire to in some way or to believe in. But I never thought about being an artist. It was never something that I was setting a goal to do. It was just a way of putting in time and being.
When did that happen then, that you decided that you did want to be an artist?
I think when I went to art school. So I went to art school in Toronto at the Ontario College of Art and Design, as well as in Halifax at the Nova Scotia College of Art and Design. And so once I was in that stream, that was that. That was my education from there on. I guess I could have gone back and thought about becoming something else, but again, it was what I was doing. And not thinking too much about how I was going to afford to do that either, thankfully.
Well, how did you afford it? Are there grants? And I don't know how it works.
Yeah, it's a lot cheaper in Canada, a lot, compared to, I live now in the United States, and it's a completely different situation where I had scholarships, teaching assistant jobs. I didn't have the debt.
You worked through.
Yeah. So I didn't have the debt. And so it wasn't a matter of having to find that job the day you graduated and make a plan. Things could happen a little bit more slowly, which is wonderful, which is really...
time to make mistakes and see what you wanted to do.
Yeah.
Different times. I was interested to know as well, when you became interested in this theme of protest. I mean, I had a few thoughts about that. I was like, maybe your parents or parent were in that zone, or I thought maybe it happened while you were a student, like it does for lots of people. Tell me a bit about that.
I think it was part of the culture. My mom was very, both my parents were of their time, hippie figures.
It's like euphemism.
Hippie figures. I think they lived on a commune for a little while.
Did they?
Yep.
In Ontario?
No, in British Columbia.
Okay.
And so they were very, into the music of their time, into the sort of changes that were going on in the country. And, my mom especially, she was half American. And so that identity was really important for her and how she connected to her parents. And so I think, very pro-union, very sort of liberal politics, but engaged in that way, having opinions.
Engaged with the community.
And engaged with ideas, having opinions, not sort of being in the middle, but really, even if they changed, deciding what they believed.
Yeah, like standing for something. And,
a little bit, yeah. So I think that was part of it. And there's been so many social issues while I've been living in America. It's hard not to be impacted by so much inequality or just events and especially the past few years, there's been a lot of renewed protest, a lot of people demanding to be seen and heard. And I think that's important. And again, it's not something that my temperament is easy to sort of take part in. And so it's a way again to imagine that space, but I'm not in it.
But you maybe, because of the way you were brought up, you feel like you should make a stand or say something in some way,
or honor it in some way, to recognize it, even if I can't be the loud voice in the room, if I can't cause the change to make that thing happen, to look up to those who are and to appreciate that. Yeah.
And just going back to your uni days, studying, or what was the through line that took you from studying to becoming a professional artist? When was there an aha moment when you thought, or when you were like, this is what I'm going to do? Because so many people, they study something and then they go off and do something completely different.
Yeah, it's interesting. I went from undergrad right into grad school, which there are pros and cons of that. But it really meant that I was focusing on one thing. And I think that's also part of my temperament, is that I really focus on one thing. And so I didn't have a lot of skills otherwise. I didn't have a plan.
Got to make this one work. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I do get, very narrow focus, and maybe that's good. My husband's also an artist, and so I sort of followed him when he went into grad school after I did. And that's what brought us to the States, to Connecticut. And that became working for artists, finding ways to make a living with the skills that I had, and teaching, working with other artists. And
do you enjoy teaching?
I do. I enjoy it. I find it really hard, as I said, to balance multiple things. So when I'm teaching, I'm not as productive in the studio. And so it really, it has to be kind of one or the other at certain points. But I think it really is this unique place where you have these conversations and people are really excited about painting, but also even just the technical parts of painting. That's really exciting. But yeah, it's kind of what I've been able to do.
I suppose also teaching, you can see firsthand the difference between when you were studying and what you were saying with grants and so on, and how that's changed now. You see the struggle with students, what they have to go through.
Yes.
So what's a working day like for you then? If you're both, do you share a studio? Do you both go to your own studio?
We do. So we have a studio at our house. We both have studios there. We also have a son. He's 11 years old, so that's a big part of the day. But once he's off to school, generally I'm in the studio first thing, and that's sort of the day. We'll break for lunch. There's day things that have to happen. Have to walk the dog, or
what kind of dog do you have?
He's a golden retriever.
Oh,
Bobby. Yep.
Bobby.
So there's some life things, but having the studio in our living area is a
so you fit it. It's part of your personal life and the professional kind of.
Yeah, it's a separate building, but it's steps. It's not a drive. So
I read your interview in the monograph for this exhibition. There's an interview that you did with Eric Fischel, the artist, and he was. It made me laugh because he was really impressed at how tidy your studio is.
Yes. Yeah, and it's true. I think things have gotten more tidy. I really think it's partly being a parent, and I think my time, the way that I use time, really had to change with that as well. So being very conscious about using my time effectively, and that has come into the spaces as well. If there's too much clutter, it's a distraction. I can't think as clearly. And so I've learned what actually works for me, that I don't actually like stepping in paint and traipsing it everywhere, and then losing things. And sometimes I just need a little bit of order in the disorder of everything else.
Yeah. Well, raising a family, and there is so much chaos.
Yes,
I can imagine you need to find a path through that.
Chaos, unpredictability, being flexible in other ways, and so it changes you. I think it was actually a benefit to me. It was really hard to become a parent. For me, I didn't really know kids. I hadn't really been around kids. I had a cat, and I thought that would help, but I was really unprepared, and so I really had to be more careful about things, more precious with my time, really valuing my time. Where I'm allowing it to be taken and where I'm claiming it. It became important. Yeah.
Yeah, I can relate. My son just turned 12 last week, and so I can relate to what you're saying. And there's definitely a sense of valuing the time that goes so fast with them, and balancing everything. It's like a balance. I find for me, if I trying to keep things in balance, then it's okay.
Yeah, and flexible. Yeah, knowing that things can't always go as you plan them.
Well, with it, for sure. Yeah. How long does it take you to complete one of these works?
It's kind of hard to say that, the different scale changes. But
I was thinking in the context of your daily life.
Mm-hmm. I've been doing more preparatory work with these paintings, where I'll start with a sketch and then a painted sketch. And the paintings have stayed closer to that initial composition than I thought they might, because before that I would work very sort of intuitively, or responding to one thing after the other. And I've sort of set a little bit more of a framework with these paintings. And it really, it depends on the mood, the days. But I'll work on them for a few weeks, and it's better if the time is pretty intensive. It is pretty focused.
Is it one at a time, or is you?
Usually it is. I really think it works better if I have multiple things going on. But again, that focus just pulls me into one thing. Yeah. And so it's a little bit of everything. But it is nice to have multiple pieces of linen on the wall. And I work unstretched, so it's kind of, that's a little bit more free to just put something up there. It can be changed later on, but I can move around. And if I have a bad day, I can move on and not take that home quite so heavily if I'm working on something else too. But yeah, things sometimes move really fast and other times feel very slow.
Yeah. It must be quite a good quality to recognise in yourself when something's not working, and just being able to say, I need to step away from this. I can't imagine that. But yeah, having that self-discipline is quite impressive, I think.
Yeah, I mean, it's not always recognized as soon as you would like. It often goes on a little bit further, being hopeful with a painting that might work out, and then recognizing, letting it go.
Were there a lot of discarded pieces from this?
There were some.
Batch?
There were some. Yep. Yeah. I have been more free to set things aside and maybe return to them later, but maybe not.
Do you think you'll continue in this? Is this a kind of apotheosis of your style, do you feel? Because there's obviously a development from the crowd, the kind of more linear crowd painting, for example, that you did in sort of 2018, to this, which are much more, like we were saying, sensuous, there's much thicker paint, and there's a looser style.
Yeah.
Can you imagine continuing like this, or do you feel the need to change?
I think it's a little bit of both. So I am at this point now, seeing all the paintings here where there's the excitement of what's coming next, as well as the unease of not knowing. And so I think there will be things that I'm taking away into the next work, but also trying out other things. So when I go back to the studio on Monday, I'll be trying some different experiments.
So you're already going right back. I was going to ask if you're taking a break between, or is it between this show and...
No.
It's not you don't need to take time off to recharge batteries, or
No. I really can't take time off. I can't do vacations. I always say I forget how to paint when I go back to the studio, and my husband thinks that's ridiculous, but it does feel like when I return after a time away, I have to go through a bad painting, and I just have to go through those motions. And so it's easier for me to stay in that world.
How do you find the references? Is it just something for the works? Because presumably, maybe you will use these references again that we've just been talking about, or will you spend time searching for others, or do they just come to you in your daily life?
They're sort of collections. So I've been collecting these figures, these characters for quite a few years now. But there's also peripheral figures. When I'm thinking about sort of different movements, different little political movements, or different social scenes or spiritual outcrops of these. And there's inspirational figures within all of them. I can get pulled into a story of a character, the biography of someone, and just, again, try to connect to those ideals or aspirations and what that could mean today. And so there's always these populations that I can return to maybe while I'm finding new ones. And so I think more than anything, probably the next work will be many things again. It won't be one specific place, time, or people. That it will be many things.
You make me think of a novelistic approach.
Okay, I like that. I like that. Yeah.
Painting. Well, listen, thank you so much for talking me through some of this. The work's absolutely beautiful, and I wish you every success with going into the next adventure.
Oh, well, thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you. You've been listening to In Talks with me, Danielle Radoichin. The sound and theme music is by Woogie Productions, and the artwork is by Patrick Waugh. If you enjoyed this episode, please pass it on to someone who you think might also like it. Please subscribe and leave a review. To pitch for guest ideas, you can DM me via my socials at Danielle Radoichin. Thanks for listening.